702.
The Naked Scientist.
Good morning, Crystal Audison standing in for Clarence Ford on Views and News, and it's time now for our regular conversation with the Naked Scientist, also known as Dr. Chris Smith. Good morning, Chris. How are you today?
I'm very good. I thought it was interesting how you phrased that, Crystal, because most people say Chris Smith, also known as the Naked Scientist, whereas it's the Naked Scientist. He also occasionally gets called Chris. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. We're in the heart of winter, Chris, but it's been so beautiful. I am just amazed about the weather, but of course it's the realities of climate change as well.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, remember that weather does change periodically. We always get outliers, we get funny periods, but the general trend is, yes, things are on the move. So you have to be really careful about sort of saying the extreme weather we had last week was because of climate change. Weather does go through boom and bust cycles. You do get extremes, but it's the trend that matters. And the trend year on year is that the world is getting warmer, and therefore we're going to see more extreme events occurring more often than they otherwise would. And also just general changes to weather patterns. I was pretty gobsmacked last week. The week before last, actually, I was sitting there thinking it's supposed to be the height of summer, and I'm so cold, I'm actually going to light the fire, which I did. I finally succumbed and lit the fire. So you say it's winter. Well, it feels like it here. But actually, it has warmed up this week. We have gone back to sort of seasonal norms where we should do. Suddenly, nature has remembered it's supposed to be summertime, so the temperature has moved the dial a bit, and it's nice, and everyone's in a good mood again. Can you tell? I sound more cheerful. I was so depressed.
Oh, that's so interesting, Chris. I mean, thank you for that boom and bust kind of, adds to making sense of the weather. So, Chris, let's start. I think we've got a full lineup here, but we'll start with, is it true if you lay on your left side of your body, it cleans your organs?
There's some claims, there are some claims, and the data are not particularly high quality. In other words, not big numbers, not done in a standardized way, that sleeping on one side versus another might be better for you in some respects. And they mainly focus on what this does to your brain. And there are claims that you sleep better on one side than the other. I'm not sure that we have enough evidence really to support this. I think it's probably noisy data, and I suspect that if we looked hard enough, we'd find there wasn't really a big difference. It's hard to envisage why, when you've got millions of years of evolution behind you, you should evolve a disadvantage if you sleep on one side over the other, when half the population sleeps on one side, half the population sleeps on the other or on their front. So really, I think this one's one of those things that is a speculative thing, not supported by good evidence, to be honest. So I would just sleep easy by doing whatever you do to get yourself a good night's kip. Because the bottom line is that if you have good sleep and good sleep quality, however you choose to go to sleep, you're going to be much healthier, both in body and in mind, than someone who gets a bad night's sleep.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. A voice note?
Good morning, Chris. I'm curious to know, when I look at people throughout the world, the only part that's different on a person's body is their face. Why is that? Thanks, Barris from Bloberg.
Hi, Barris. Well, I disagree, because while the face does show the most dramatic changes, that it's not entirely the face. If you look at people in different geographies, you will find that there are all kinds of differences, both inside and outside, that make us work differently. Take a look at the London Marathon and see who the front runners are. They are tall, wiry Ethiopians, and they always win the London Marathon in amazing times, because where have they grown up? Where have they evolved to live over a really long time? High altitudes, dealing with much thinner air, and there's all kinds of advantages conferred by selection on those populations that mean that they are really good at those sorts of events. Look at a swimming pool, on the other hand, and you tend to find some groups work much better than others because of, again, body shape. So it's not just our faces. We work biochemically differently, and we have different anatomy subtly across the world. But why we notice faces is because our brains are heavily programmed to bias us towards looking at faces and paying particular attention to faces. There is a region of your brain, the superior temporal gyrus, which is really powerfully wired up just to interrogate faces. And the reason we use faces is because obviously they've got eyes in them, and we need to look at people's eyes. We get enormous amounts of information about what people are thinking, what their next move might be in the chess game by looking at their eyes. But the other reason there's a lot of differences in faces, apart from the fact we use them to recognise each other, is because about 80% of your genome is used to program how your face forms, whereas other bits of your body use far fewer genes to put themselves together. So that you're going to see the greatest degree of change or diversity in faces, but that's not to say that other bits of the body aren't different between different populations who are adapted over evolutionary time to living in certain geographies.
We have a call from Anne from Thornton. Good morning, Anne. Please go ahead with your question.
Good morning, Dr. Smith. Nice to talk to you. Dr. Smith, I have two questions. I saw a program of a gentleman who was locked in a freezer, a shop freezer. I want to know, he said after 2 hours it felt as if his ears was falling off and he was trembling so much. What happens to the body when your body temperature drops so drastically over a long period of time? My second question is, another gentleman had his 2 hands literally chopped off without anesthesia. Again, what is the body's reaction to such trauma and blood loss? I listen on radio, Dr. Smith.
No worries. One fairly gruesome question and one intriguing question. The intriguing one about the freezer first. The human body is warm-blooded, as are many animals, and this means that enormous effort goes into maintaining a steady state body temperature. We have sensors in our skin and in our deeper organs and tissues that tell the brain, and specifically a region of the brain called the hypothalamus, what our body temperature is, both outside but also inside. And it uses this to maintain that core steady state body temperature, and it does it by adjusting a range of things. It adjusts how fast you lose heat and also how fast you make heat. So how can you change how fast you lose heat? Well, the first thing a body does when it detects that you're in a colder environment and therefore the rate of heat loss has increased is it shuts down the flow of blood to the skin. And the man says his ears felt like they wanted to fall off because the ears are a huge surface area. Look at an elephant. An elephant puts blood through its ears and flaps them in the cooler air to lose heat as efficiently as it can. We're the same. We put blood through our superficial tissues that's hot, and it can therefore lose heat to the surroundings. So if you cut down the supply of blood to your peripheries and the superficial tissues, you reduce the rate at which you're losing heat. So the first thing the body will do is, in a cold environment, cut down blood flow to things like your fingers, your toes, ears, end of your nose, all those kind of areas reduce their blood flow, and this makes them colder, so they feel colder, and eventually they're going to go numb because you're going to cut off the blood supply to the nerves in that tissue as well, which is why they go numb, but you slow down the rate at which you're losing heat. You also clamp down arteries further upstream that pushes more of that blood into the core of the body, keeping your core temperature up because you're not putting much blood down the peripheries. The next thing the body does is to say, well, I need to make more heat. And it can do that in 2 ways. One, you send signals that boost metabolism. If you rev up metabolism in your tissue and burn more calories, turning the calories into heat, you can produce more heat to keep your blood warmer. So that's one way of doing it. The other thing you can do is to activate muscles with shivering, and that's the other thing that the man in the freezer presumably did. When you activate shivering, you're turning on both pairs of muscles that would normally move a joint in opposite directions. So muscles work in antagonistic pairs. So one muscle moves the joint one way, the other muscle moves it the other way. Normally the brain controls things so that when one muscle turns on, the other muscle turns off. When you shiver, it turns on both at the same time, so they're working against each other. So the joint doesn't really go anywhere, it just shakes a little bit backwards and forwards, but the muscles are clenching and unclenching rhythmically many times a second, and the result of that is you're wasting loads of energy, and because muscles are only about 30 to 25% efficient, most of the energy that you're burning as calories to move the muscles is turning into heat, and that's being transferred into the blood that's flowing through the muscles and warming the blood up, which is then brought back inside the body to keep the core of your body warm. And so this is how the body controls temperature, and it does it as well as it possibly can for as long as it can to maintain a steady state. Eventually, it's going to stop working. If you put someone in a very cold swimming pool or a very cold environment, not enough clothes on, they are eventually going to overcome or surmount these mechanisms, and core body temperature is going to fall. And once it falls below a critical level, you begin to see an impact on bodily functions, and this includes consciousness. So people will eventually become confused as they become hypothermic, and then they go unconscious, but it's not necessarily at the end of the line. Because what can happen is a person can be unconscious in that state, but because their metabolic rate is so low, you can still get them back. And there are amazing stories of people who've fallen into lakes and things like that. They've been unconscious, even stopped breathing and had no heartbeat for tens of minutes, and then been resuscitated. But because their body temperature is so low, the rate at which the tissues deteriorate is very, very slow. So people often recover completely if they're got to in time. But it is critical that they don't stay in that state for too long, because there are going to be points of no return eventually. Now, your second fairly gruesome question about people losing body parts, when you chop bits of the body off, it depends if you do it cleanly or if you do it traumatically. By cleanly, I mean you take a nice sharp knife and just chop something off. Because when you tear things off the body, you can trigger an arterial reflex, which is that our arteries, muscular arteries, can sense, the tissues can sense when they've been traumatized. And the first reaction they have is a defense mechanism to clamp down or constrict. And this can prevent blood loss. So there are stories of people who've had arms and legs torn off by farm machinery, for example, and they've survived despite what would be a catastrophic loss of blood otherwise, because you've got this protective reflex, which when you tear an artery or traumatize an artery, it can clamp down and help to reduce the rate of blood loss. Cut it with a knife, though, and that is less of a stimulus, so you're more likely to bleed out under those circumstances, which is why stabbings can be, I mean, there's a range of reasons why stabbings are terrible things, but there's one of the reasons why you're more likely to lose more blood from that kind of thing.
We have several voice notes which we'll start playing.
I'd like to find out what causes blemishes, and then at what age do blemishes start to affect one's skin? Does it mostly happen to men or women? I'd like to find out as well that there's so many creams that claim they'll be able to sort out blemishes. Like, is that really true? Can existing creams sort out blemishes, or is it something that the skin cannot change as soon as it develops blemishes? KK Kemsbay.
Okay. Blemishes can mean a range of different things and different things to different people. And our skin can be changed by age quite naturally. And one of the biggest drivers of that is sun and sunlight. White skin is more susceptible to sun damage than black skin, and this is because black skin has more melanin, the dark pigment in it, that can absorb ultraviolet, which is the damaging element of sunshine that has a photo-aging effect on skin. One of the effects of sun exposure is a darkening of the skin. Anyone who goes out in the sun and is out in the sun for a period of time knows their skin will darken. Doesn't matter whether you've got black skin or white skin, everyone's skin gets darker in response to sun exposure. But with chronic sun exposure, some bits of the skin can respond more than others, and it produces an inhomogeneity. You see a patch where there might be a darkening of the skin in that particular area that stays darker. And this is one sign of photo-aging of the skin. So that could be one sort of blemish that's being referred to here. The best way to avoid that is to limit your sun exposure and try not to burn ever, because this is more likely to damage skin in a way that could lead to skin cancer, for example. The other reason we get blemishes on our skin is because of damage to the skin through trauma. If you scar or cut the skin, then some people have a more exuberant than normal healing process. And this is actually more common in people with black skin than white skin. You get what's called keloid formation. And for various reasons, the healing process accelerates in some people, and they have an overgrowth of scar tissue which can produce a lump or bleb on that bit of the skin, which if you in some people, especially if it's on the face, it can look unsightly. So some people go and have or try to have some surgery that can fix that. So if you're someone who scars more readily, think very carefully about what sorts of interventions and things you put on your skin in order to avoid that happening. Some surgery is obviously necessary sometimes, but if you can avoid damaging your skin, that can help. Do these creams make a difference? If it was that easy, then everyone would be using these things all the time. The best thing to do is to do prevention is better than cure. Try to look after your skin for as long as you can, as best you can, and the sun is your worst enemy, as are cigarettes. Smoking causes aging of skin and skin discoloration, blemishing and wrinkling worse than almost anything else. So limit your sun exposure, limit your cigarette exposure, preferably to zero, and try to eat a healthy diet. Those are all the best things you can do and are probably much more effective in the long term than any cream or product you can buy at huge expense off the shelves of a chemist.
Thank you for that, Dr. Chris. One more voice note.
I watched the episode on Grey's Anatomy quite some time ago. A 15-year-old girl came to the doctor, to the hospital. She didn't have any facial expressions. She was about 15 years old. And what they did is they removed muscles from her leg to put it in her cheekbones and everything so she can get facial expressions. Is that true or is that not possible? Thanks. John Caldriver. Bye.
Hi, John. I haven't seen the episode in question. I'm not familiar with that story, but it's certainly possible to reroute muscles and nerves and use them for various reasons. And plastic surgeons do this a lot because if you've got a muscle, you've got a blood supply, and sometimes you need just the blood supply, sometimes you need the muscle and the blood supply. So certainly there are situations where you can take a muscle, you mobilize that muscle away from its normal attachment, and you rotate it round, taking the blood supply and the nerve supply with it, and you can plumb it into a new area. And this can restore function to somebody who, through either disease or trauma, can therefore get movement back in a certain part of their body. Or if they've lost a body part, you can mobilise a muscle that's in the area and then use it to control a new part of the body that you fashion out of the tissue that they do have. That's certainly possible to do. Transplanting whole chunks of muscle, more difficult, but not impossible. You'd have to plumb the arteries and veins back in, because the thing that really matters to any tissue anywhere in the body for its viability is its blood supply. So you've got to be able to put blood in and get blood out. If you can't get the blood out, then the organ will die just as quickly as if you can't get the blood in. So that is possible, but you'd have to ask, well, why would you want to do that? I don't know about the issue with the facial expression. I can go and have a look at that. I don't know if that's just creative artifice or if there really is a story in that. I'd have to have a look. But certainly plastic surgeons do move muscles around, usually rotating them on their existing blood supply, nerve supply all the time to do these important reconstructive processes.
Thanks, Dr. Chris. A last question before I have to let you go. We have, at the moment, the city has put out an alert about if you get bitten by a seal, there's rabies. And so there's a question from a listener. How do you seek medical attention? Is there anti-venom? Is there what happens in a case like that, Dr. Chris?
Well, with rabies, we never take chances. It's almost universally lethal, and around the world every year there are 50 to 100,000 people who die of rabies, most of them in Asia and also the African continent. And so any kind of mammalian trauma, bite from saliva contaminating a bite, that kind of thing, dog licks, cat licks onto wounds, this is a risk, and never take chances with it. We have very good prophylaxis against rabies, but you have to act quickly, especially if the bite is to your head and neck, because the incubation period is dramatically faster if you are bitten on that body part. And the way we do it is, if you have a significant exposure, you get a course of rabies vaccine, but you also get given antibodies against rabies into the site where you've been bitten and also into a muscle. And the rationale for doing this is that you give the antibodies immediately, and this soaks up any virus that might have been put into your tissues, and that buys you time while the immune system builds a response to the vaccine to give you more reinforcement, both antibodies but also some white blood cells to catch the virus in the cells. And this hopefully stops it invading your nervous system, which is what rabies otherwise will do, and go into the brain, destroy brain tissue, and kill the person in the process. There's almost no survivors of rabies, so never take chance. If you think you've been exposed, go and seek medical advice immediately, and there is a really tried and tested protocol for how we manage rabies exposure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris Smith, giving us such insightful thoughts around science. It's our regular conversation every Friday at 9:30, also known as The Naked Scientist. Thank you so much.